Everyone. My name is Maxine, as Kamala just said, and I will introduce our panelists now. We have Mrs. Sharon Morris-Cummings, an attorney at law with over 30 years experience. She has worked in various public and state enterprise sectors in Trinidad and Tobago. She is a former president of the Family Court in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and has also worked as a magistrate in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. She is currently the corporate secretary at the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. We also have with us today Ms. Misha Lobban-Clarke, who is a management, public relations, and communications specialist with more than 20 years experience. Misha currently holds the position of executive director of the Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She was Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of the Caribbean, and she's currently ex officio member of the Council of the Barbados Chamber of Commerce and a non-executive independent member of the Board of Directors of Strategists Alternative Funds. She is also a member of the International Women's Forum Barbados chapter. We also have with us Ms. Alison Dillon Chibili, who is the founder and CEO of AMDK Governance Solutions Limited. Alison is a global expert and author on corporate governance, ethics, CSR sustainability, and risk management. And her experience spans Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South America, the UK, and the US. She has worked nearly 30 years as a company secretary, and she's a fellow of the Chartered Governance Institute and a UK solicitor who has won global awards for her work. At this time, I would like to invite Mrs. Sharon Morris-Cummings to share on today's topic, dealing with different board cultures.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Moderator Wynne. I want to thank CCGI for inviting me to be on this forum. I'm privileged to be on this panel. Hi, Alison. I attended one of your courses. So today, we're dealing with managing effectively with different board cultures. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have different boards arising from the private sector and the public sector. And of course, you also have statutory authorities, right? For example, the Children's Authority is a statutory authority having been created under the Children's Authority Act. So in discussing this issue of managing effectively with different board cultures, you would say, well, what would cause there to be a different board cultures? Well, every board that comes into an organization may have its own culture, and it may not be apparent what that culture is at the very beginning of the tenure of a new board coming in, say, to replace an old board. So based on my experience, what causes the culture of a board to be shaped? When I reflect on my experience, I had experience before in different organizations. I think the composition of the board, the very selection, greatly impacts on the culture that the board has. The number of persons who are there, their skills, their attributes, their life training, their experiences, they all bring this to bear in this part that I would call the board culture. What will influence the board culture? When you're coming in, I have found in my experience that when a new board is coming in, the culture of that board is partially shaped by the experience of the last board. If there's any public issue that was being dealt with and there's a public perception, board members may come in with a view that they do not want to fall prey to what happened with the last board. And some board members, in terms of their experience, it's like once bitten, twice shy. And also you may have in the public domain perceptions about an organization that are floating out there. For instance, they're very difficult, they hide information. So all of that impacts on the culture of the various board members, which feed into a general set of values and beliefs. So each board has its own culture and it's feeding into the organization culture. And in this matrix, the corporate secretary has to perform her essential role to be essentially the guardian of corporate governance, to arrange meetings, to ensure that statutory filings are taken care of, to see about board training, etc. We all know the multifaceted role, that very important role that the corporate secretary carries on in the organization. So when a new board is coming into an organization, I have found that the skills that have been most important are the softer skills, the skills like emotional intelligence, because you cannot assume that this new board, that this is what they would want and this is how they would want things to be put to them. So quite often I find myself looking at the board from a point of seeking out emotionally, what are people's emotions? What is driving them? And when you use these softer skills, you'll better be able to communicate, because communication is another skill set that you need to engage and employ. I've also found that when boards have come in and there's an issue per se of trust from before, transparency and candor, which are always very important to a corporate secretary, are even more important. And of course, we're not forgetting confidentiality. Confidentiality is very important and always important. So I have found that you have an open mind to discover what the new board culture is. You engage with trust and confidentiality. This is especially important where you may have perceptions about the culture of an organization. You need to leverage your personal integrity to ensure that your relations with the board and management, that you are forthright and honest at all times. Of course, as corporate secretary, you still must bear a level of independence and tact because you'll be required to broker relations between and among the board and management as required. In one instance, when there was a board changeover, I recall there was an issue in the public domain and it left a perception that not enough information was provided to the previous board. So as corporate secretary, you need to be self-aware. You need to be aware of what is going on in the environment so that you'll be able to act and change your tactic as is required, always adhering, of course, to the principles of good governance. I've also found training for the board to be very effective and useful in brokering relations with a new incoming board. Quite often I found that having a site visit, organizing a site visit for the board of all the operations is very useful because it quickly brings them into understanding what their role is, what their mandate is in terms of the practical elements that are required. So this is very important, the organization familiarization. I also find that providing documentation such as policies, all of the core documents of an organization would be very important in dealing with a board culture that is different to the one that you had experienced before. So the skills like personal awareness, independent mindset, effective team working, empathy, these are all very important to what you are doing. So those are the most of the important skills that I find that I engage your soft skills when you are treating with different board cultures. everyone is not the same, and you need to take the time to understand the requirements of your board. So in addition to the soft skills, you find that you really have to make sure that you're on top of your core skills, knowing the law, organization of meetings, and so forth. And all of these engender trust as between yourself and the incoming board members, if all goes well. So basically, that is my take on it, on this topic. But I'd also like to suggest something as well. While the corporate secretary is there and makes attempts to broker this new relationship in terms of effectively managing and discharging obligations as corporate secretary, I would like to suggest that we start to think outside of the box and apply some scientific elements in treating with the board and the discharge of their functions and their mandate. So I respectfully suggest that it would be good if government deepens its training initiative for board members ahead of their being placed at organizations. I think everyone would agree that a new world order is upon us. Resources are very scarce. So we can ill afford, persons learning on the job, as it were. If you have a board that is steeped in strategic development, that has a mind in terms of a mindset in terms of improvement, those things are very important to a board to carry out its function in this day and age. So my suggestion would be that additional skill sets of training, the board be exposed to that before board members are placed on different board. And I say this with the greatest respect to every board that I've been on. This is not to cast any aspersions, but I'm just trying to think out of the box and prepare us for this new world order, right? So strategic thinking and innovation would be very important to any organization now. The New World Order requires resilience training. The State Enterprise Performance Manual recognizes the pivotal role played by state enterprises. Some have specific mandates from the government to undertake developmental projects in critical areas such as education and sport, etc. Now, if their roles are so important, and I acknowledge that they are, it is high time we acknowledge that by preparing them as best as we can before they take up their specific duties. The board composition should also look forward and include a number of young professionals. So you will have a variety of skills. The next generation will be mentored in that regard. And also, I have found that sometimes you try to manage with governance as corporate secretary, but sometimes the structure of the organization may be problematic. Is it not time that government has a special agency to help organizations with their structure, so that in that way, the governance and structure could more closely realign to achieve the objectives and the mandate of the board? I thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that wonderful discussion. I was particularly appreciative of your practical guidelines for corporate secretaries in this new world order. I will invite our other panelists. I don't know if anyone had any comments to what Sharon spoke on.
I think when she was talking about emotional intelligence skills, I think that tends to be what differentiates us from some of the compliance specialists. I know compliance specialists do have emotional intelligence skills, but it's easier to be able to say, well, the law says this, or, excuse me, the accounting standard says that. Whereas, as Sharon was saying, a lot of what we're doing is building trust, building relationships. And so I think that was an important part of what she was talking about. And obviously that has an impact on your board's culture, because you obviously want them to be a body that trusts each other as well as trusting you.
Yes,
Maxine, I just wanted to speak to the whole, the fact that board culture really speaks to team orientation and then the dynamics and how you pull all of the dynamics together to ensure that the board is cohesive, that it is able to constructively challenge, but at the same time, collaborate in the best interest of the entity. And therefore, what it speaks to is, as you said, indeed, it's about building relationship. It is something that is cultivated over time, yet it is one of the strong building blocks of what makes a strong and effective board. So yes, relationship is important and key to relationship building, as you said, Sharon, is you have to employ the emotional intelligence. So I just wanted to support your views on that.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you, Misha and Alison. At this time, I will invite Misha Lobban-Clarke to give her presentation.
Thank you very much, Maxine. And I'd like to just start off first by commending the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute for continuing to really be a thought leader in the area of corporate governance and best practices. And thank you for the opportunity to participate on this panel. I chose to look at my contribution to this discussion on board and board culture, but within the context of the theme, looking at how the board and the changing culture beyond COVID-19 can help to help companies to really survive beyond that. So, just to reiterate the points that were made is, board culture speaks to really the practices and the behaviors. And I really think that pivotal to that has to do with the kind of skills and talents. So when you look at the elements of board culture and what makes an effective board, that then would ensure that what it offers in terms of strategy and guidance to the decision-making process of a company. The board culture then has to be one that is very open, where communication is facilitated, where the board members feel that they have the freedom, even if they are dissenting, but they can freely express their views, and that board is not just engaged at the level of the board, but they are engaged in terms of their interaction with the CEO and management. So they are able to collaboratively work together. So indeed, I have to pull back on what Sharon said, because all of that really speaks to not just the professional expertise that each board member brings to the table, but the good interpersonal skills that they have that can then augur for a good symmetry or what you call a good team dynamic, while at the same time, it doesn't engender group thinking, but it really does give way to persons to be able to challenge thoughts, challenge and probe. So I think for me, it has to do with, number one, the diverse composition, and that composition is not just about the gender or the professional experience, but that it also speaks to the interpersonal. I also feel that the skills of the board chair is extremely critical being able to keep the team dynamic. The person has to be skilled in being able to not just how they come prepared for meetings and being able to effectively navigate the process of board meetings, but that they encourage the analysis and they encourage discussion and they encourage the probity. You know, I just thought of bringing my own practical experience to the table and share from 2 experiences just to cement why a healthy board culture, in my view, is so critical to good board performance, and then it impacts not just the board in its performance, but also the competitiveness and the performance of the business. I think in this time that we're in, you know, the board dynamics and the board agility and the board culture is very critical to how they can help businesses move beyond the pandemic and move beyond what COVID has challenged us to become, which is changing our modalities, changing how we think, how we operate. So, you know, I use 2 case studies from my experience to say that I serve as an independent non-executive director on a recently established board, which promotes alternative investment in the Caribbean region. And while it is new and the culture is still one that is evolving, I can say that as a best practice, I see the diverse composition on the board and that diversity of perspectives, diversity of gender, diversity of experience and skill sets, then redound to a promotion of diversity of thinking and even cohesiveness and how matters are distilled. That board is also engaged because persons feel that comfort level, and it is, to me, driven from the very top because of the style of the board chair, you know, a female, but one who has strong negotiating and leadership skill. And added to that, you have a strong management team that then augurs well for that engagement. So the board becomes an engaged board at the level of the board and at the level of the executive. But I've also had the experience of sitting on as an ex officio member on a not-for-profit. And by virtue, and I think in our introduction, Sharon alluded to that to an extent, that because boards may be different in their types, their mission, and their very construct, then it then determines what that board culture is. And therefore, in this second case study that I wanted to share as a practical example, we have a board that where the members or the persons were nominated or selected by the member organizations. And by virtue of how the members are nominated, what we found is that there was inherent conflicts of interest. So the dynamics, you had difficulty in achieving that level of cohesiveness and cohesion because board members were selected and they were driven more by representing the interests of primarily of their member organization. And then added to that, that board had a relatively weak governance framework and the elements that make for an effective or healthy, in my view, board culture. It relies in your board evaluation processes and your board competency profile that definitely you need if you're going to be able to attract to your board the requisite and fit for purpose competencies that you need. And that was also missing. And what was also missing were like some very clear benchmarks that would determine how board processes, effectiveness of board processes. The plus side is that they realized the inefficiencies, and of course they embarked on a comprehensive review of the governance structure. But when assessed against best practices in terms of the corporate governance maturity framework, it was highlighted that the company, while it was compliant, for example, in legal requirements, there were severe gaps in terms of the level of governance, etc. Thankfully, a number of recommendations based on good corporate best practices were put forward to enhance that framework, you know. And I therefore want to just end by where, on the note that I started, that within the context of the theme, governance beyond COVID and following the North Star and resetting values to create value in an organization, we realized that COVID has brought certain things to the fore, you know, the need for building resilience and continuity and digital transformation and sustainability, and things like environment, enterprise value creation. They are not just buzzwords, certainly, but they are in fact our new norm. So what we need for a board and a board culture in an environment like this that we have, that to me will not change. You know, there are predictions that say, you know, what we're dealing with now in 2021 will continue. This level of uncertainty and this new normal is what we have to adapt to. And so we need a board culture then that is forward planning, a board culture that is agile, a board culture that is adaptable and flexible, because these are what now in this current environment will in fact help to determine how effectively a board can lead an organization in creating value and resetting value and creating value. And so I just end by saying, you know, things like the pandemic has shown us that there is greater importance on people and the environment, and therefore we no longer have boards that are just focused on shareholder value, but there's a shift in the focus to enterprise value creation, and the fact that, for example, a company's not only measuring profits, but placing value on how its activities then impacts society. And a case in point is that in this new environment and the impact of COVID, we actually saw companies looking at the difference between whether severing staff and doing what it could to make sure that that's a last resort. And those decisions and those changes and cultures have to come at the top, where the persons at the board level are more aware and they are keeping abreast of the developments that are taking place and how the kind of impacts that and shift that COVID is requiring for crisis management and assessment of risk. And these then define to me what the new normal of board governance is. And I'll just end by quoting one person who speaks to the fact that a board member who was interviewed recently in a research conducted by the Diligent Institute. And Don Zaire, who sits on the board of Spirit Airlines, said, all the social and human capital issues that management teams are currently facing will have profound impact on businesses moving forward. And it is important that these topics, therefore, be discussed regularly in the boardroom. And one positive from the struggle we as a society have faced over the past year is that the issues are being moved into the spotlight and action plans are being put in place. But even more importantly, it's not about having the right strategy, but having a strong underlying culture and talent. And that is how we truly win. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Misha, for sharing your experiences with us. I invite Alison and Sharon to comment at this time.
I think I was particularly taken by the comments that you were making about having to have flexible and resilient boards. And I think, you know, the point that you made about, I think some of the things around stakeholder engagement and looking at social environmental issues had started to happen before COVID, excuse me. But I think what we've seen is that COVID's quickened the kind of uptake of those things. And you know, personally, I don't think if we get to whatever the new normal is, I don't think they're going to be able to roll back what has happened. It's going to be interesting to see if some companies try, but I think it's gone too far now, as if you were listening to Mervyn King last night, as he was talking about the kind of treadmill that started, and hopefully we're going to see some coming together and collaboration to actually get reporting on it, which will reinforce the importance of boards discussing what's going on. Okay. So thank you for that.
Yes, and I also endorse what was said, especially in relation to toxic cultures and boards having to be agile and adaptable. And certainly COVID has thrown the gauntlet down, a strong challenge to all of our institutions. And when a lot of these institutions were established, of course, COVID-19 was not around. So it's very important for these institutions to have the knowledge and have the capacity to bring that adaptability, strategic human resource management, all these new elements that we need in navigating this new normal.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Alison. We now invite our final panelist for this session, Mrs. Alison Dillon Chibili, to present.
Thank you. And I hope my voice stays. The change in temperature from being used to being in the tropics to moving to the north of England is making my voice a bit croaky, so apologies. I think where I wanted to come at this topic was really to talk about what we as company secretaries need to be doing, you know, with the boards that we're trying to, you know, serve and advise. And I think the important thing is for us to be able to familiarise ourselves with the culture of the board really at two levels, which is one at the board level and then secondly at the personal level. And I think at the board level, and the two previous presenters, Sharon and Misha, have covered some of these issues. So, you know, what's the history of the board? I mean, at the moment, boards are dealing with the crisis that is COVID. They may have been dealing with previous crises within the organisation, whether it's been a fraud, whether it's been, you know, a merger or an acquisition or the departure of a CEO, that will impact the culture of that board. So, you know, it might be it becomes, you know, it goes from being, you know, a very engaging board to being a board that suddenly becomes a micromanager because of the crisis that is happening. You know, or it may become, you know, a very hands-off board because there's a lot of trust that is going on between the board and the management. So I think knowing the history of the board and being able to deal with what impact that has on the culture. The two previous speakers have also talked about the longevity of the board. If you have a very new board, the level of trust is going to be a lot lower than if you've got a board that has been there for many years. And you may also have to deal with, if you have a board that has overstayed, there may be a lot of assumptions going on, less challenging, less constructive criticism. And I think as company secretaries, we need to find ways of trying to get those boards more engaged. And whether that's how we draft the agendas, the topics we put on the agendas. I know Camille was talking about having, putting governance sessions in there, but trying to find ways to engage boards. Another area is external forces influencing boards. So these are your nominee or representative directors. And obviously we all know that directors are supposed to act in the best interests of the company. They're not supposed to be fettered, i.e. they're supposed to come in, listen to everything that happens, and then make a decision on the best interests of the company. But these nominee directors or representative directors have challenges with that. And how can we as board secretaries, help them with that? And some of it, again, is around agenda preparation, making sure that there's time on the agenda, that the chairman is briefed, so that they're allowed to put across their particular interest group's point of view. And then, once a decision is made, if that decision goes against that particular interest group, how are the minutes written to reflect what information was made available? How was it that the board came to a different point of view? So how we draft the minutes can be very important. Also, obviously, training may come into it to help the actual nominee director understand what their role is and how they're able to fulfill it. The kind of final thing I've got on the board culture is around whether your board members are there voluntarily, which often in the private sector they are, or whether they're there, they've been mandated to be there, which sometimes in the public sector or even in the not-for-profit sector, we can find that that's the case. And obviously, again, their level of engagement will be affected by that. The culture, the way board meetings are conducted will also be impacted. And really, again, as board secretaries, some of the mandatory participants may not have the level of knowledge and skills that they need to participate to the level that you'd want. So again, looking at, training, maybe information sessions where you can brief these people before the board meetings. I think, and again, this was talked about or has been in one of the earlier sessions, onboarding of directors is key, not just talking about their roles and responsibilities, but also talking about the culture of the board, enlightening the new director or directors as to what the history of the board is, some of these external influences that may be coming into play. I'd also say have a set of board protocols. One of the first board meetings I ever attended, I walked in a pair of trousers and I could see people's faces go, and I thought, gosh, what have I done wrong? And there was another lady on the board who came over to me and said, I only have one skirt and I wear it to this board meeting. So if we can agree at future meetings that we wear trousers, then we'll both be very happy. And, you know, and I've been to another board meeting where I was the company secretary, where we had two American gentlemen coming into a traditional British board. And the first thing they did was take their jackets off, which again was seen to be a definite no-no within that particular boardroom. So, you know, if there are particular cultures, you know, how do you address people? Where do people sit? You know, boards have very quirky little things that may not be obvious to a new member coming into the room. So, you know, as co-secs, being aware of that, maybe trying to get it written down into a protocol so it's a kind of formal, although hopefully flexible document, but at least it can make people comfortable when they first come into the room. So the next level is the personal level, and apologies, I do have a slide for this because otherwise it will take me forever to explain it. And I think many of you, because I recognize names, have probably seen this slide before, but I think it, you know, it does, you know, it bears reiterating the fact that it does actually play out in meeting situations. So what you have here is the vertical line talks about how, as individuals, we take on information. So we either take on information through the experiences that we have, or we take it on through theory. Facts, data, statistics, basically reading reports. The horizontal line says, what do we do when we get that information? So we can reflect on it, think about it, or we can act upon it. And the scientists and this particular model is based on work done by David Cole and Bernice McCarthy. They basically say, in a perfect world, we would move up and down these two lines equally. However, as human beings, and I hope you all realize this, we're not perfect, and we tend to have a preference for one or other of the ends of these lines. And that creates certain behavioral preferences. And I use the word preferences rather than styles because it doesn't mean that you're kind of stuck in that box. You can do the kind of other behaviors as well. It's just that we tend to have a preference as to what our behavior is. So just briefly, the observer reflectors are people who act on experience, act on emotions. They tend to be very, very creative. They operate very much at 35,000 feet. And they want basically people to be involved in what's going on. So if you have a chair who has this style, they will tend to be the chair that will try and involve everybody in the discussion. So they're likely to go around, you know, asking every director individually if they'd like to contribute. They do need time to reflect. So as company secretaries, we need to be thinking about giving them time within an agenda or time to look at papers so that they are able to have that time to reflect. The second category there is analytics. So these are people who love facts, data, statistics, and like to take time to think about them. So these people can be bureaucratic you know, but obviously are very essential if you're looking for directors who like reading board packs and those nice long reports that often get produced. The third group are planners or strategists. So these are the people who take theory and start moving it into action. These people love models. and can actually model businesses to death if you're not careful. But again, they're great for planning, you know, making sure that projects are delivered. And the final group there are what we call the dynamics. These are the just do it people. Tend to be very entrepreneurial, massive risk takers, and they're the ones that tend to drive a board into making a decision. Okay, now as board secretaries, you need to make sure that each of these quadrants is covered off within your meeting. Okay, so somebody presents a proposal, you need to have some ideas, you need to think about the impact on people. You then need to have your statistics and facts and data. You then need to have some kind of a plan, and then you need to actually action the decision that's been taken. So if looking at your board, you decide, well, actually, we've a load of analytics, say, on the board, who might be slow to make a decision. And they're always going to want that last piece of information that can take them across the line. So how do you manage to actually get them across the line? And it may be that you suggest to your chairman that, you know, you bring in a project manager, or you can bring in, you know, a member of the management team who can fill in the gap of actually the strategic planning to actually get you into the action quadrant. Okay, you know, observer reflectors, they're up at 35,000 feet. So how do you pull them down into a plan? Again, if you don't have any planners or strategists there. You know, if you have a board full of dynamic personalities, how are you going to slow them down so that they're actually looking at facts and data? So there's quite a lot, I think, for company secretaries. And Christy, you can take the slide away now. Thank you. You know, for people to be thinking about. I'll finish on some taglines. So you can recognize observer reflectors on your board. They always use words about involving people. Okay, so this board's lovely. It's a real team. I feel like I'm in a family. That's observer reflector language. Or they're talking about people. Analytics will be saying, tell me what the policy is. Tell me what the law says. Tell me what the feasibility study says. Tell me what's in the budget. Those kind of statements tend to come from analytics. The strategist planners, show me. You know, show me the benchmarking study. Show me how we're going to measure this. Show me the plan. And your dynamics, trust me. I know it's a steep cliff, but we'll jump off it together, and trust me, there'll be a soft landing. Okay, and I think with that, I will leave it and hand back to Maxine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison, for your presentation. That experimental cycle is always thought-provoking, and it will lend a lot of assistance when trying to understand the board and its members. I will ask Sharon and Misha if they have anything to add to what Alison discussed.
I like the cycle as well, but I had a question in mind, which is, what if you then have a board chair who doesn't have a grasp or can, or have the skill set to be able to pull out the different, whether it is a person who is reflective or just an observer. And therefore, to me, here's where I come back to where one of the points I alluded to is that the role of the corporate secretary is important, but also that of the chair. And maybe this is where the corporate secretary would then have to have the level of skills to be able to bring to the attention of a chair who fails to understand the dynamics. Because unless that person has the skill to pull all the dynamics together, you're not going to have a healthy board. The board is not going to be cohesive. And therefore, so going back then is, to me, communication and engagement is really critical. Critical at the level of the board and the board chair, and the engagement with the corporate secretary. And I'd just like to add, and then I think Sharon alluded to that earlier, is that this is where the board has to also go through a process of continuous learning and development. And a board has to recognize that that is also critical to its ability to remain on top of its role and being able to be what you call, I like the term, the high performing board. And that's my contribution.
I especially like I would say, to me, the personality types that Alison spoke about in the experiential cycle. And you can see that in the various board members, their interaction, how they relate to others. And I feel in helping to bridge that could be a re-engineering of your board notes to ensure that they speak to the different types. You know, that you would have information in terms of a narrative, but you also have graphs and charts, and of course your risk analysis in it, and information about how soon it could be done, etc. So you could appeal to all types to ensure that there's more engagement at the board level. And in terms of training, in particular where you have boards like for instance in the Children's Authority, there are so many pieces, different pieces of legislation. So ongoing training is imperative, because I'm a lawyer and I cannot grasp the fullness of all the legislation in one. And then there are so many amendments. So you always have to keep on top of it. And also structurally, I'd like to see a recognition that board training is equally important as, say, employee training, because sometimes you have these cultures where you mention board training and it's like, oh, that's an unnecessary expense. But this is the heart. That is going to drive your strategy. And it's $1 well spent if you can get the thinking to be closer aligned to the objectives in terms of giving directors choices and exposing them to new ideas, new ways of treating with things, because sometimes people are stuck in the mindset that they are accustomed to. But I have found that education and information sharing can help bridge that divide to some extent.
Sharon, I'm not sure if that's where you were going, but I do find that you may have some persons on the board who feel that because of the level of skill or experience, or even the age, that they may not necessarily be willing or open to embracing the concept of training. But another form can be where you have the sharing of information and thought leadership articles, etc., because those can be are what we call, that's also helping to keep board members abreast of trends and fully aware. So I think the training doesn't have to be formalized. It can just simply be one that says, let us have a culture where we allow for opportunity of information sharing and foster that information sharing that will help us to remain relevant and help us to remain on top of what the strategy and on top of being able to effectively drive that strategy and even reshape that strategy at particular times, depending on what's happening in the external environment. And certainly that's what COVID has done. COVID has forced not just company management, but the boards themselves to also begin to look at resetting. So resetting is taking place at the very top, and it is also taking at the individual level, at the board level, and at the company level.
I would agree with you, Misha. And I mean, one of the things I've done through my career, knowing that I've got very senior board members who feel they don't need to be trained, is to introduce things like, you know, discussion sessions. So you have a pre-discussion session on strategy, but bring in an external facilitator who then actually is training the board about what their roles, responsibilities with regard to strategy are, and some of the other issues around strategy. So not call it training, but create, you know, it might be, you know, you could also have an information session. So, you know, we're going to be talking about risk at the next board meeting. So perhaps, you know, would it be useful to set up a session where we can just brief you on what your role is, some of the things that you'll be hearing about, so that we spend the time at the board meeting actually focusing on the doing part of it, rather than necessarily, you know, why are we doing it, what needs to be done. And I've found, you know, senior board members sometimes appreciate that because they don't want to be spending long hours on one particular day going through a lot of this stuff, whereas they don't mind signing in for an hour and doing that bit of it before the meeting, and it also helps them with their preparation. So don't call it training, call it something else.
Call it continuous professional development or continuous.
You know, call it, you know, I call them information sessions, discussion sessions.
Indeed, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Certainly. Certainly.
But training in disguise, basically.
And the truth is, Alison, you have, when you look at a composition of a board, somebody may be selected for a particular area of expertise. Mm-hmm. Let's say their accounting skills, another for, in terms of their legal expertise. And I just feel that the onus is on, and while you bring all the different experts and skills to the board level, the onus is still on the individual who may be a legal expert to get informed in preparation for a board discussion about other aspects. Read up about risk management, read up and get an understanding of marketing and how that is impacting on strategy. Read upon so it's just about the members of the board also understanding that they have a responsibility, and that's where also the corporate secretaries plays a critical role in helping to foster that.
Yeah. And I think you've just hit on another dynamic, which is the dynamic of having super directors, i.e. directors who are specialists in one particular area. And so whenever the topic comes up, all the other board members look at that particular director to give them the advice and the guidance on what the decision should be. And you know, that in itself can become very dangerous and is something we need to watch out for. And I think, you know, whether you get that individual director to then, you know, give an information session to the rest of the board so that they're upskilling on that particular topic, or whether you have to look at and advise your chairman to get another expert to come in to give another viewpoint to counter what that particular director is saying. You know, as a COSEC, I think it's very important to have a strong relationship with your chairman or chairperson, so that you can have these kinds of discussions about how do you produce and provide the information so that the board can make effective decisions? Because after all, that's what our role is to help the board in making effective decisions.
Yeah, so if I may interject, guys, we do have some questions on the chat, and we have entered the last half hour of this session. So I want our moderator to ensure that our participants feel that they have they're also getting their questions addressed. So I'll help by starting off with addressing to you first two questions, which came from Kendra Thomas. I think they're related, so I'll just read them both and you can respond, and then I'll let Maxine take it from there, right? So Kendra asks, what are some of the factors which dictate a certain board culture over another? So it's the tone set at the top. And then she also asked, as a follow-up question to that, I thought this was a really great question too. What practical steps can be taken by the corporate secretary, in particular, to effectively transition from an unhealthy, toxic culture to a healthy, inclusive one, which is based on mutual respect and trust? And that is outside of the interpersonal skills that you know that Sharon addressed already earlier this morning. So it's a tough one. Who wants to jump in first? You know, what are some of the factors that dictate the board culture, and what can the corporate secretary do to transition a board from a toxic culture?
I think, Pamela, I think we've talked about some of the factors which dictate. I think all of us have mentioned you know, what can create a toxic culture at the board. Yeah. I think, you know, the practical steps from transitioning, I think as Misha has kept saying, I think it's really important to get your chair engaged, because if you have a weak chair, you're never going to transition from an unhealthy, toxic culture into a healthy one. And I think as, you know, corporate secretaries, if we're able to help a chair to engage, to identify what are the issues that are making it toxic, and then try and deal with those. And I think, you know, you may need external help in doing that. I mean, I've found where I've been in these situations that getting an external third party who's kind of independent and is not seen as being an insider to come in and work with the board to try and help them to identify what their issues might be, and then how do you actually deal with them, has been very helpful. But I think, you know, you need to look at agendas, you need to look at when and how is the board meeting, you know, what's its relationship with management, what information is it getting, many of the things we've been talking about today, and then come up with plans to try and solve them. My final point, I suppose, is have a board evaluation with an external evaluator. And you as COSEC, make sure you're in there and that you're briefing that external evaluator as to what some of the issues are.
I think in the case study I presented, Alison, I also highlighted from the case study what were the elements that that led to the inefficiencies and the recognition, and how they moved from that place of the lack of consensus and cohesiveness, was just realizing that the board was becoming ineffective because they weren't able to make decisions. And those were then the driving forces that made them themselves evaluate their own effectiveness. And they were able to then, with the support of the corporate secretary and the board chair, understanding and looking and understanding that, you know, if the board is ineffective, it speaks to his or her role as well. And therefore, these are some of the factors that propel them to bring in an external corporate governance expert to then do that assessment that I referenced. And it was when they did that assessment, they were able to have that empirical or the analytics to say, you know what, you're legally, you know, your legal requirements, you're meeting those requirements, but you have real and serious gaps when it comes on to governance. So yes, it takes the board coming face to face with the realities of how they function, because the dynamics play out at the meetings. You see it, and then it impacts the effectiveness of the organization. So all of that will play itself out in the overall strategy and the overall performance, both at the level of the board and at the level of the organization. You know, I just thought about, you know, what if then you have a board chair that is resistant to that change? And here's where I think the negotiating skills, and I think Sharon spoke to emotional intelligence of, let's say, the corporate secretary, has to be one that helps the board to see that it will be to the benefit of the board and to the organization. So it requires just employing those skills, bringing those soft skills to the negotiating table. It's almost like an attorney, you know, being able to the power of suasion. But these are some of the skills that have to be brought to the discussion and to that process, in my view.
Yes, and I think in terms of some of the factors which dictate a certain board culture over another, I can think of history, because sometimes you might change out some members of the board, but not all. So you have some with bearing the history and the knowledge of, okay, this is how things were done. You will have a new set of members who have a different expectation. So you can have this a kind of bifurcated culture at first. Which one will give way will, you know, time will tell. But you as corporate secretary, if you can see, like perhaps in the past, if there was something that happened that management is very sensitive to, in that it caused a great problem in the organization, you have to be almost like a whisperer and indicate to the chair. And I have also gone in the past to influential members. You know, you can see those who also have the chairs there to speak, because some directors may be a bit shy, especially if they're newer, and they may not want to openly say certain things. So if you get feedback, you can take that feedback collectively and confidentially and do a little whispering and say, you know, this is what is happening. And I have found that if your professional credibility remains intact in terms of following the normal confidentiality, etc., it will be helpful in influencing. It's not always successful, but it would be helpful in influencing the decision to bring in, let's say, a third party to see, okay, let us have a test, let us examine and, you know, assess where we are and what we hope to do basis our mandate.
Thank you to all for those comments. We now move on to Sharon's question, and she was inquiring what was the company secretary's role in this current virtual culture of having members turn on cameras. She was inquiring if you all think that was necessary, turning on cameras for our current virtual culture.
I think it's important in establishing a sense of cohesion, because when, for instance, a new board was inducted, that board started out at a time when you did not have COVID. So persons were accustomed to meeting, and then overnight, you have this low touch environment. So in order to keep that initial contact and emotions of it going, this is what was suggested, that persons come on camera. There was also a policy that spoke to that, but you have to get persons' agreement, not just a policy. Persons must agree that this is good for us, it's good for our teamness, it's good for our cohesion as board members. So you have to broker that as well, because persons could have bad days and they could decide, I'm not turning on the camera. So I have been thinking, well, if you have icebreakers, etc., you know, it would make the meetings more interesting and persons will be more emboldened to come on camera and agree to do it time and time again.
And I think I'd add to that. I mean, some people have said it's for privacy because, you know, they don't want people to see their homes. But there are so many of these kind of Zoom backgrounds, or whether you're in other products as well now. I don't think that's really a valid excuse. And I think, you know, if again, from a COSEC point of view, and you know, I've had to do this even before COVID. You know, make sure you should go and see your directors. Make sure. I mean, obviously in COVID we couldn't, but have a conversation with the director. You know, do you have an internet or a broadband? You know, do you need to buy bundles? What can we do to help you to be able to engage through a virtual situation, even if it's having a quiet session beforehand with how do they use the platform, because that might be something that they actually don't know how to turn their video on. You know, I've had that experience as well. So, you know, they're used to having an assistant or somebody that deals with all the tech stuff, and they suddenly find that they're having to try and deal with it. So, you know, just ringing up and saying, how can I help you? You know, what are the things I can do to help you to get the most out of this virtual experience that we've got to deal with?
I think because you're moving from the norm of in-person interaction, it really would, I believe, and it should be a policy. I think Sharon alluded to that for board meetings. It fosters that level of confidence and transparency, and facilitates the interaction. You know, there's such a difference between when I'm not seeing someone on camera versus when I see them on camera. So I think if in order to continue to foster that healthy dynamic and team interaction, that it really should be something that should be necessary. That's my view.
Thank you. We do have a couple questions which we'll try to get in. I will ask maybe one panelist to respond to each question just to speed things up, right? Joanna asked, what's the role of gender, disparity or not, in a board's culture of governance?
So who are you asking to respond?
I would leave that to you all. Anyone that think they'd like to respond, they can take the mic on and speak.
All right, I'm quite happy to speak to that. And the answer is absolutely. You know, boards that have a balance of men and women on them tend to be less aggressive. They tend to bring in some of the more people-orientated aspects to decision-making. You know, we could talk about this, Joanna, and I doing some sales for CAMLA for later on. I know she's got a Women in Governance, what is it, workshop conference coming up, and I'm sure they're going to talk a lot about the impact of having balanced boards, really. You know, I think there are reasons to have both men and women on boards, and you know, as well as people with other diversities. You know, you should try and have a board that reflects as much as possible your customer base, your client base. It's not always possible. Obviously, if you're selling baby clothes, you wouldn't be able to have babies on your board. But as you know, as much as possible, try and reflect you know, the people that you're trying to provide your services or products to. So sorry, we could talk about it all day on the diversity issue, but hopefully that gives you some information. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I would actually send this one to Sharon. Sharon says, I heard Sharon speak of public perception and Alison about the external forces influencing boards. What challenges or opportunities do you see the company secretary facing in addressing the board culture if there is a negative public perception and some uncontrolled external forces?
Well, that's a kind of a googly, it's a very difficult question to answer in the sense that I think every corporate secretary has these moments where, you know, they're challenged to the point where they think, why am I doing this? But then you keep in mind what you are there for, what your purpose is, and with your integrity and resolve to ensure that the organization is properly served, you keep going at it. If you have to go to the chair, you keep going to the chair. You may have to speak to other persons who are influential on the board. Do that in order to get your point across, right? So let me just go back to the question, the opportunity. So you have an opportunity to help shape the culture of the organization by doing that. It's not work that will get you plaudits and pats on the back. And in fact, people will be upset with you sometimes, but you have to just forget that and carry on, right? So in terms of the external forces, some of the things I found like they are beyond you, because I worked in a company and the shareholder mandate would have overtaken all that was supposed to be done. Well, that was the shareholders' mandate, and the board did what the shareholder mandated. So there was not much room for negotiating a change there, but there was also the opportunity to remain professional, to remain straight on a line in terms of your duties, to make sure corporate governance was practiced, good corporate governance in the process. So it's not always a happy outcome when you try to make an intervention, but it cannot be said that you failed to try.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Alison, the next comment / question is actually based on your framework that you presented. So I'll ask you to answer this one. She said, Andrew, my apologies. Andrew said, the cycle is quite insightful. The corporate governance topic is relatively new to him, and he wanted to find out if any consideration has been given to developing a framework to identify the characteristics outlined within the board. He says,
I mean, the cycle that I used was originally developed by a gentleman called David Kolb, right. K-O-L-B, in a learning environment. And he was attached to an organization called Hayes. So you can actually go online and actually fill in a questionnaire and find out more about your style and preferences. If you Google David Kolb Hayes and you know, Bernice McCarthy, who's also an academic, took his work and took it into a meeting environment. And she has her 4 forces within a meeting, I think it's called, where she talks further about this, and she goes into detail about what each of these different preferences, how they play out in meetings. So the fact analytics like agendas, you know, very sticking to agendas, whereas dynamics like flexibility. You know, obviously, again, analytics like paper, dynamics don't. Strategies love problem solving and discussion, so they need space on an agenda to do that. So she goes through, you know, a lot of those issues. We do use it on some of the courses where we go into a lot of detail into it, because obviously I just briefly touched on it this evening. So if you are interested, Andrew, in going through it in more detail, talk to Kamla, and I've lost the plot as to when we're doing another course where we talk about it, and I'm sure there will be one coming up at some stage in the future. And you know, we spend quite a chunk of time going through each of the quadrants and talking in detail about them, and then we have some activities where you can think about what impact that might have. I will say one thing finally, lawyers tend to be analytical, and one of the arguments for the ever-growing board packs is that as corporate secretaries, we hear directors saying, I need some more information on X. And our response is to go and create more paper. When actually what the director may be asking for is just a few bullet points, because the information is actually in the board pack somewhere. And this is where we tend to get frustrated and say, well, hang on a minute, why hasn't he read page 356 of the report I gave him? You know, all that information is nicely set out there. And you've got a director who is not going to read 356 pages of the report. So I think, you know, the point Sharon made about how do we as corporate secretaries impact the culture of the board is a very valid one, because we can if we're not careful. And I think we need to make sure that what we are doing is positively impacting and not negatively impacting just by our own styles and preferences. So I hope that answers Andrew's question.
Yes, definitely. Kamla, I'm not sure if we have sufficient time to take questions from the floor.
No, it's already 2:30, Maxine. So given that we only have a half-hour break between now and our next panel, and trust me, that time flies very quickly. We need to give persons a short time.
Okay, so I will hand over to you now to close.
Sure, thank you. Let me start by thanking you, Maxine. You did a lovely job here as moderator, and we look forward to having you do and participate in some more of these sessions like this in the future. A very, very special thank you to Sharon, to Misha, and to Alison. Sharon, this was the first time we've been able to have you on as a panelist, and I hope it will not be the last.
Yes,
Misha knows I have been after Misha for a while now, trying to even get her on Governance Live, because I feel her experience is really so vast in so many areas that it's good for us to be able to have the conversation and get some of that out there for other persons to be able to benefit as well. And of course, Alison, you know, you are such a wealth of experience, and I am so thankful that you are choosing to share a lot of that with us. We have so much growing to do, and I felt that a lot of the discussion that we've had from this morning to now reflects just how much learning all of us have to do, and also some of the very fundamental issues that we take for granted. And even that question with respect to, you know, should cameras be on during board meetings? Have we really properly addressed it in the different boards? Because it seems that it's like whoever feels what they feel like at the moment, you know. So some things that need to be developed and structured and have reasons for why we are doing things a particular way moving forward. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our participants who are in the room as well. We will be moving on at 3 o'clock to the next session, which will be looking at the role of the corporate secretary in really supporting family-owned businesses. And our 3 panelists for the next session will be Kenny Atai, Alima Mohammed, and Francis Bain Cumberbatch. So, you know, it's going to look at an entirely different area, but one that is still absolutely necessary for us to understand, because family-owned businesses really form the majority of businesses in the country. So I look forward to when Margareta and Pisa will take over as our moderator for the next session, and we continue our discussions. So you guys have a short break, and remember the room is going to be open within minutes of us closing this one. So simply click on the next link on your agenda and enter the room, and then you can have your short break. All right, see you guys in a few minutes.